This brings us to a very interesting and critical part of our conversation today. In all the policy discourses, we talk about enterprise, we talk about the state, we talk about social actors, but a lot of critical university research has never been spoken about, and we today believe that research can no longer be restricted to universities or journals. We want it out there. We want the latest research to be incorporated as operational working models in the AI world today. So with that objective in mind, we have a very esteemed panel that I'm going to call upon stage from academia. I would like to invite Srinath Srinivas on the podium. Thank you. I would like to invite Devyani Pandey on the podium. And I would like to invite Upmeet Singh on the podium. As a manner of introduction, Dr. Srinath Srinivasa, he's a professor and dean of R&D at IIIT Bangalore. Professor Srinath is a distinguished academic leader and researcher serving as the dean at the International Institute of Information Technology. He leads the Web Sciences Lab, focusing on the impact of web and artificial intelligence on society, including social empowerment, inclusive governance. Holding a Ph.D. From Berlin Brandenburg Graduate School for Distributed Information Systems, he contributes to national narratives like Karnataka Data Lake and works with NITI Aayog. Dr. Devyani Pandey, her interest lies in the field of technology policy, public perceptions about new technologies and policy design. She has written papers on challenging governance emerging technologies like autonomous systems, micro-mobility devices, examining behavioral intention of the public to use them, and their regulation. Any novel technology that is introduced can be adopted in a world picks her interest to see the potential for adoption and how stakeholders can address their risk through effective policy making. And I would love to introduce Dr. Upmeet Singh as well, a very critical stakeholder from our governance. Dr. Upmeet Singh is the principal advisor of policy and AI at the Capacity Building Commission of India, and he currently serves as the principal advisor under the flagship mission of Karma Yogi initiative. He works to enable the shift from rule-based to a role-based capacity building ecosystem that is aligned with performance-linked governance. In this role, he's also working on the integration of AI frameworks beyond individual civil servants to capacity building institutes, ministries, and departments and organizations. So it's a very critical function in the governance that we have with us today. So with no further ado, I would love to have a very, very interesting and insightful conversation amongst the members of this panel, focusing on the role of academia, of research, and also governance to shape how AI regulation should be operationalized in our society today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me here. Since you correctly, I think, introduced me as an academic working on technology policy, particularly on what are the implications of using AI on regulation, and how does the public perceive these very new systems. I am an academic of public policy, and in a lot of areas, I see where is the public, right? How do they perceive AI systems is a very important point that we often miss in the governance of AI systems. So in my view, the sustainability of using AI systems will depend not just on how well the AI systems are performing, but also on how good are the governance arrangements going to be. And with this, I want to dive into who are the actors involved in governing AI. there's the big tech. We have these corporates, we have these companies like Google, OpenAI, etc., that are actually leading the conversation on governance. Then, of course, we have the government, and alongside we have civil society organizations as well. So, as part of the research that I'm doing in terms of how these voices, how these different voices, and obviously there's a lot of chatter about what AI can do, where should we bring in AI, how AI adoption will take place. So, there's a lot of noise around this, but there are also a lot of diverse voices that come together. Or maybe not, right? Because they are diverse voices. So we have the government, particularly India, that came out with the AI governance guidelines very recently in February this year. Then we have the civil society members. What are they talking about? And then, of course, we have the big tech or the corporate sector that's pushing towards innovation. So I want to give you a glimpse of the leading countries, the EU and the United States, on how they are approaching the regulation of AI. We have sort of accepted the fact that there is a pacing problem wherein the laws and regulations are not able to keep up with the innovations, and that's something that by now, it has been a couple of years since we've been discussing about AI governance. We have accepted that yes, the laws haven't kept up, and then how do these governance arrangements need to be? Now there's slowly this movement towards, oh, what are the principles that we should focus on? India focuses on AI for all, responsible AI, etc. When we look at the EU AI Act, which is the first legislation globally, we see that it's a very rights-based approach that they have. They have a very unique system where they have classified AI systems in terms of their risks. So they prohibit certain systems, AI systems. They say, okay, certain systems are allowed based on their characteristics. And they have this really novel component of high-risk AI systems, which includes surveillance, using AI systems in healthcare, etc. Which they say these are high-risk AI systems, and they have very, very specific requirements set out, like conformity assessment, etc. So that is what the EU is doing, where the European Commission usually takes the lead, and they do ask for perceptions of other actors, research organizations working on AI governance, etc. As opposed to what is happening in the US, which is a rather decentralized governance system where the government, through executive orders, comes out with guidelines on and off, but more or less the states have the power to decide how AI is supposed to be governed. And then when we come to India, we have had NITI Aayog take the lead by coming out with a foundational report on AI systems, on how AI should be for all, on how AI needs to be responsible, etc. Right? So, what is the way that India should take ahead can also be adapted based on what's already existing by these countries like the EU, US, etc. I'm not bringing in China into this because China has a very top-down governance sort of model. And India, I think initially, Parveen started her remarks by saying that India is a democracy. And that leads to very novel sort of challenges when it comes to AI regulation or AI governance. So I think I'll sort of stop here with my opening remarks, that there are voices out there that we need to get into place. And possibly in the second round, I'll take you through about what are these different actors saying? What are these actors saying when we look at reports? Are they being represented or not when it comes to reports by Deloitte, McKinsey, etc., consultancies, or reports by NITI Aayog or the government? And what are the big tech doing?
Thanks, Dr. Devyani. Some very interesting points. So I'd like to make 3 points from my perspective as well. Coming from a technologies first kind of an approach. So I have been involved with AI in its classical form as well, what's now called the GOFAI, good old fashioned AI. and as well as the current Gen AI kind of. One of the things that we are also doing is working with NITI Aayog currently. We are the lead knowledge institution for them. Kind of assisting them in using both data science and AI for designing policy interventions. And so some of the observations which we came up as part of this research is this. One, there is no doubt that AI needs regulation. There is, however, really the key comes in how well can it be enforced or how well can it be implemented, and is it just a legal problem, is it just a policy problem, or are there some technology gaps as well, right? And we are basically looking at this question, and our answer more or less is yes. That is, there are actually major technology gaps that we need to address. So one of the technology gaps that we are looking at is what I call a TRA, trust resolution architecture. So what do we mean by trust resolution architecture? AI is not the only thing that is giving us a risk. Earlier, also software, for example, application programs had their own risks, safety risks, and how did we manage them, right? And so there were lots of technology solutions. One, for example, we could containerize an application using Docker or some other. So it'll create a sandbox within which the application runs, so that it doesn't do anything unsafe. And second, there is at the operating system level, right? If the application tries to address something illegally, it'll. So nowadays we can't do any critical operations on a computer, like accessing a device, without going through these layers, right? And so something similar is required for AI regulation as well. It doesn't need to be an operating system, but it needs to be a layer that resolves trust, because directly trying to regulate AI is actually quite a foregone conclusion that it may not be possible, right? One, of course, it's an inherently stochastic system, so we can't really regulate a stochastic system. Second, it is evolving. It is continuously getting trained and retrained, and it's beyond our control. So we can't completely do that. There are some guardrails you can put, but even guardrails are not completely foolproof, right? And so we are kind of working towards that. How do we build a TRA, a trust resolution architecture, towards that? And what do I mean by TRA? I'll just, by virtue of example, what I would say is, let's say you just send your Aadhaar card to someone, a WhatsApp scan of this thing. We don't know whether it's genuine or fake. We don't know what's happening. But on the same thing, if that someone accesses your Aadhaar card through your DigiLocker, right? Now they can be sure that this is your genuine ID, because there's a trust resolution that's happening, right? And so similar things that we need for AI as well. That's the first point. The second point I'd like to make is about the issue of monocultures, right? And so the way AI works is try to predict the next token in some way, next token, next pixel, or whatever. And it tries to, it's again an inherently probabilistic model. So whatever is the dominant choice kind of gets presented, right? And so there's typically one interpretation that comes through, one way by which something gets recorded. So there are quite a few papers that are that talk about what kind of monoculture is this AI coming up, right? And so we are working on yet another research called From Data to Stories. That is, can we address the plurality which Dr. Parveen was talking about? As a country, as a nation, we are inherently pluralistic. There are so many different interpretations. There are so many different worldviews, right? And so I get a small data point, like say, maternal mortality rate is very high in India, compared to global average, right? So what do we do about it? So that's the policy question. There's no one answer. There are multitude of answers in different regions. There are different reasons, and there are different approaches one needs to take, right? And so this is what we call the from data to stories, or what we also call the from NPOV to MPOV. That is from neutral point of view to multi-point of view. So can I take a data and interpret it in different ways, contextually sensitive ways? And so that's the second point I wanted to make. The last point I want to make is about agentic AI. So with autonomous agents, if you look at the way current agentic AI works, right? So you give a prompt, and the agent can basically break down the prompt into smaller tasks, which it can use some set of tools and execute it, right? And if you see carefully, this is exactly what a compiler does. right? You write something in a high-level programming language, it breaks it down into low-level programming language, and does. Except it's a very sophisticated compiler, right? And but if you look at real autonomous agents, you and me, for example, or maybe even take your pet dog, right? And you give it some prompt, you give it an instruction, it will do something, okay? But sometimes if it is not in the mood, it won't do it, right? Or more importantly, if it is ill or if it is not well, it won't, it won't act according to what you're saying, right? Or even more importantly, if there is a threat to itself or to its family, it will proactively act, right? And so there are in fact all these are actually not new. Research on agency have actually addressed most of this, but they've not come into AI models so far, right? And so how can we include this intelligence of self-preservation? For example, I remember in the 1990s IBM had this huge research initiative called autonomic computing. Now they're called self-star. How can computer be self-configurable, self-healing, self-preserving kind of, right? And so notions of self, which is something that we are working on, how do you bring it into agentic AI that can make them inherently responsible in some way, right? So they are trying to preserve themselves. In the process of preserving themselves, they're preserving something bigger than themselves. So that's some of the work we're doing. So I'll stop.
Thank you, Srinath. Devani, I think you spoke about the global context and etc. And in the Indian context, we have the AI guidelines issued by NITI, right? And there's a sutra. There are multiple sutras in that guideline. Right? One of the sutra is fairness and equity, right? And one of the major implementers of fairness and equity will also be the government, right? Because there are a lot of services that the government provides, right? So, for example, if there's a completely neutral, and if you look at the government, they all work in very siloed environments also, right? The same data is collected by various departments from the same family and used for different schemes, right? Health department will look into the morbidity rate, the nutrition department will go to the same, family using a different objective or a lens, right? And therefore, there is an inherent bias within the government ecosystem wherein they use that data in a way which will suit for the purpose that they are looking at, right? And maintaining the sutra of, a welfare state. Now, when Devani spoke about all these elements, and Professor Srinath also spoke about this, there is an element of what does the Indian government do, right? There are high-level guidelines, etc. But if you leave it for interpretation, there'll be 10,000 versions of the AI guidelines for implementation within the different departments and organizations of the government, right? And at one side, under Mission Karmyogi, there's the government who's creating a pool of AI native officers and staff, right? Right from the frontline workers to the top chief secretaries of the state, right? Or at the center of the secretaries. But the organizational guardrails around which the government works is not AI native, right? And it's a slow moving animal. So if you leave the interpretation there, the way they will implement it within their organizations can create a lot of issue for the welfare state and the objectives of the government that we have, right? The training institutes, be it the Labasana where all the IS get trained, to the National Police Academy, to the state administrative colleges, right? You are creating subject matter experts, trainers, etc. But are the training institutes themselves, geared up enough to be AI native to create and support AI native civil servants is another question, right? So I'm just trying to move from the policy line to the actual, government ecosystem that needs to be also AI native, AI supportive, right? If there is a lot of neutrality in the algorithms and when the data gets shared between the government entities, there could be an element of that same bias getting replicated and the departmental bias, which was helping the welfare fabric be maintained, getting eroded. So I think those are some elements that we might have to look into as government, and we are trying to work around with various departments. In fact, I think we are working with Devjani's team there at NITI, right? So we are also trying to see what will it take, right, to break it down into a little bit more, double click on it, like we said, DFD level 1, DFD level 0 to DFD level 1 and 2 maybe, right? To see how does it enable and encompass the government fabric. Devani, you had the second round, right?
so much, Dr. Srinivas, Dr. Upmit. I really appreciate your points on how the technology can be a solution and then what capacities have to be built by the government. And I'd like to highlight something about what are the voices from the civil society saying about AI governance. They look at AI governance from a more rights based justice perspective, that we shouldn't leave out the voices from the marginalized, how surveillance is going to be a problem because AI systems tend to collect a lot of data, maybe without consent. So they are not as much, perhaps, excited about the pace of innovation as the corporates or the big tech are, but they are more worried about things like opacity, lack of transparency, the marginalized, the vulnerable people not being part of the conversations on AI. And what we are seeing in the reports by, say, consultancies and the big tech corporates is more about how we need to be pro innovation, which reflects on the governance arrangements that they're proposing, that we should have more of self auditing, we should have more of internal checks. Rather than them being more third party checks, which actually the EU AI Act says that there'll be third party conformity assessment required. So, are the big tech or are these corporates thinking about rights of the people who will be affected by the deployment of AI systems? Perhaps not till now. And that's why I was suggesting that there is a need to bring together these voices. In addition to that, there is also a need to see how the people perceive these AI systems. So, the United States has research organizations like the Pew Center that actually conduct public perception surveys about literally all the topics that are relevant. They have had surveys on how people have felt about AI adoption. And somehow India has not been able to capitalize on this aspect of what the public really feels about deployment and adoption of AI systems. NITI Aayog is at a very novel point, or a novel sort of governance location, if I could say, if there's a degree, that they can do such work where they roll out surveys, and while rolling out surveys, they educate the public about AI. So AI literacy has been a point that has been harped upon many a times, that we as the public are going to be the people who are going to face these AI systems. We need to be literate about how to use these AI systems. So in the garb of perhaps educating the public, there should also be surveys about how do they feel about adopting these AI systems. And just last point on the sutras, very rightly mentioned that. I feel that there's like a need to move away from abstract principles. Right now, they seem to be abstract, but how are we going to implement fairness and equity? How are we going to implement something like security, explainability, right? Which is where we need scientists to come in on how to create explainable AI. So we need to move beyond like abstract principles into how are we going to implement them, and also focus on prioritizing what sort of AI systems do we need, does the government need, maybe in public administration, or in social policy, or in public service delivery, and also to participation. So I think I'll end my points on how we need to move away from abstraction to participation and prioritization.
Very wonderful points. Just to comment on a few of that, it kind of triggered a couple of thoughts in me. So recently we were working with NITI Aayog and other, even at the state government, we were going through some of these SDG principles, Sustainable Development Goals, and different approaches towards that. So one of this approach is called LNOB, Leave No One Behind, right? And we were kind of looking at how they were being implemented, and how they're kind of addressing the problem of inclusivity or exclusion. And one of my colleagues remarked, which kind of stuck in me. The way LNOB is implemented is like saying spare no one. in the sense. So what I mean to say is that there is a particular framework, and when we say inclusion or exclusion, uh, it is not just a economic uh, element. There's actually a worldview element. People get excluded because their worldview doesn't match with the mainstream worldview. The way they interpret the world is different from the recent term. So this kind of triggered a line of research that we have been pursuing for some time, what we call narrative spaces. That is, can I, instead of creating a database or a knowledge base, can I create a story base? That is, can I get a set of stories where there are different perspectives coming from different worldviews that are there, and how will a given event or given policy get interpreted in different perspectives, right? And there are also a couple of my colleagues who are working on this whole problem called re-narration. That is, re-narration primarily means I have some fact, but how do I explain it to you in a way that you can relate to it, right? And oftentimes it does not necessarily mean excluded communities or whatever. For example, if a new law comes in DPDP and so on, somebody needs to re-narrate to me because I don't speak legal language, right? And so even you and me needs re-narration, right? And so these are some research level problems which I see has not been really well addressed, but there's a lot of scope. There's a lot of opportunity for original research to be conducted. So.
We are above time, so
Dr. Rukmeet, I'll let you address and then we'll open up for questions.
I'll just take a minute. So, Tivani, what you mentioned, the civil society will look for justice. The big techs will look for innovation, and in between all of this will be the civil servants who will get sandwiched, right? And with no interpretation and without being a native. So currently we are in a state, we've just had a national conclave, and we realized that almost there are 1.6 crore civil servants who are there as part of Mission Karmyogi, state center and all. And they have done approximately some 10 crore courses, right? And majority is in AI, right? Fractal AI course was one of the highest ones that were taken up. But the ecosystem is not yet developed for them to leverage that. So what they're doing is shadow AI. ChatGPT se copy kiya, e-office file mein dala, and who's taking the responsibility around it, right? And the decision that he or she as an officer is taking is going to impact multiple people, right? It's not just going to be for that institution or that enterprise. So I think the impact at the government level is at a much bigger scale, irreversible, and therefore has to be, like you said, we have to interpret it. Look at how do I even tell it to the frontline worker, the narrative that you spoke about, right? The frontline worker will not understand the jargons of maybe people like me or maybe even higher to me, right? So how do we make them understand? The Anuchet was speaking about that body cam thing, right? Now, if it does the Panchnama, and if that Panchnama tomorrow is integrated to a death certificate of, what we have as e-district services, you're not even dead there. It created a Panchnama and, a death certificate is also issued, right? So it could create issues there, right? So what we are seeing now in the government are very siloed implementation of one or two AI cases, right? It's not the organizational level usage. The data sources that should be referred to have not been identified. Someone was speaking about this before me. Government, many of the documents are internal to the government, right? Those guidelines and all are just the final documents. So how we also have to, in the government space, have to identify which are the data sources that we need to refer to. What are the guardrails around it? There can be an initiator, but there is an approver, a presenter, and then there is a big boss, what we call as competent authority in government, right? Who will approve it, right? So those stages have to be defined for us also as a whole.
Thank you very much. In keeping time in mind, so I would like to possibly just take one question, and we welcome you to take, ask our experts at lunch more questions. Yeah. So one question, please. Yes, please go ahead. Next time.
Trust resolution. Also the single source of truth. So how do we try to look at the single source of truth? Yeah. So that's a, there are much deeper questions. Actually, it can go on for a long time, but let me kind of put it this way. We all live in an open world, right? In the sense, we don't know what we don't know, right? So it's not the ignorance that's the problem, but the ignorance of our ignorance. And so short answer is we'll never know what is the single source of truth. But we can converge closer and closer with different perspectives, with different multitude, plural.
Coming AI into picture, right? It's more dynamic.
Correct.
Anything can be construed, modified, changed at any point in time.
Right.
But the source of truth still remains the same. But who is going to identify and find out where the truth
Where
comes
the
from?
yeah.
That's
So
where
the
the
whole just one point to that. So the whole approach that we are taking with multi-point of view is that we are not going to give you an answer, but for a question we are going to give you responses from multiple perspectives. Now you decide, right? You decide, and how much to kind of.
We will take one more question from the back, please. Can you please pass the mic there? Back. Send it to the gentleman. Samit will get back to you after.
Is the Indian Army a good example of learning how to actually lead let's say, an AI deployment situation? I mean, the Operation Sindoor is a classic case where a lot of AI is used. I see that a lot of conversations are really about leadership. And I think the Indian Army is a great example of where chain of command is clear, clarity of thought process is there, accountability is fixed, and margin of error is zero. So is that a good example for us to look at when we look at how to deploy AI?
Okay. See, I'll not comment upon Operation Sindoor, but in general, see, the fundamental way that the Indian Army works or the armed forces work, I was in one of the countries and they said the directors at the institutes where the army personnel are trained are handpicked, right? Or Sarkar mein agar aap pick up any of the institutes, and don't quote me outside, it is a shunting position, punishment posting. Kuch nahi hai to training institute ko head kar lo, right? So we have to change that mindset first, right? The director general or the directors of the institutes that are training our officers, civil servants, also have to come with a framework that are selected properly, right? So we are trying to work on and that was one of the themes that we had as part of our national conclave, where we were trying to see, if say suppose a director's selection process is clear, after he or she has done the tenure, can they also be incentivized to get a position of their choice in the next posting, right? So yes, the Indian Army, at least that part of the structure that they have, of selecting the institutions where their officers get trained, is actually a good benchmark for the other institutes also to adopt.
Okay. So with that, we come to an end of our last panel. I would like to call upon Vinay to pass on, mementos of thanks to our esteemed panel. So thank you all.